Thank you all very much for being here at the latest instantiation of IDSC's Data Citizens series. My name is Ken Goodman. I'm co-director of IDSC's Program in Data Ethics and Society, direct the ethics programs at the Institute for Bioethics at the University of Miami. It is a great privilege today to introduce our guest who is actually here. Will not be online. Well, he'll be online for you, but he's not online for those of us here in the younger building in Coral Gables, where IDSC hosts many of its activities. Dr. Eric Meslin comes to us from, might be from Frederick, Maryland, most recently. But when I met Eric 20 years ago, he was at the University of Toronto. He then went on, and I'm going to get the order of this wrong, but you'll forgive me. He then went on to direct the Human Genome Program for FCAHS in Washington. He became President Bill Clinton's director of the National Bioethics Advisory Commission. He made his way to Indianapolis, where he directed the Institute for Bioethics at IU. And then he spent the last several years as director of the Canadian Council of Academies, analogy to the US National Academy of Sciences. So Dr. Meslin has been working for a very long time as somebody who does ethics across the curriculum on challenges related to new technologies. It could be the genome, it could be digital technologies, and their extraordinary role in the way we try and incorporate them and metabolize them in the context of public policy and public service. Against that background, thinking clearly about values is what we're going to hear about today from Dr. Meslin. And with that, and with gratitude to all of you who are online, including all those of you from Ontario Tech, anybody from UT today, I think maybe so, but there's a broad international audience here, and we are delighted you're here. Thank you so very much. With that, Dr. Meslin.
Thanks very much, Ken, and thank you all for coming. I'm just going to adjust the mouse here so I can be able to see. Whoopsie, let's go back. Already he's showing his facility with technology. It's a real pleasure to be here. I want to thank Justin for the invitation to come down. My good friend Ken Goodman, who you've already met and has introduced me, and those of us who are here in the room. There's a small group in the room and there's a group online, and I'll try to speak to both groups. The topic for today is, on the one hand, so broad as to be almost ambiguously abstract. But what I hope to show you this afternoon.
You could sit down.
I could?
Yeah, you might be more comfortable.
Let's try that, shall we? He says to no one in particular. Better like this. It's kind of a pet topic, as I say, so broad as to almost be overly abstract and inaccessible. And yet what I hope to share with you this afternoon are some reflections on what I think is probably the most central challenge in all technology assessment, evaluation, planning, and implementation. And that's how to figure out what the right thing to do is. And figuring out what the right thing to do implicates a topic largely around values. And I've described this in a way that I hope will be challenging in the title. This is intentional that I call it Value and Values with the S highlighted. I didn't invent that construction. Others have. Most notably, oh, goodness gracious, the former governor of the Bank of Canada and the former governor of the Bank of England, an economist, not an ethicist, Mark Carney. I happen to have his book, which I'm not here to promote. I get no credit for it. But as I will sort of make obvious throughout my remarks today, I'm going to tell you what I'm talking about and then say something and tell you why I'm talking about it. And this is one of those moments. I've intentionally, and you can read behind me, I'm not going to read every slide. I want you to be able to multitask. It's intentional that I've taken a quote from Carney's book that was published just a couple of years ago. Kearney's an economist. He's a policymaker. He is a person who works in the real world, you might say. And in a admittedly thick tome, he has captured the essence of what my remarks will be about today as applied to data. He speaks, for example, of value and values as being distinct and yet connected. Why is that the case? And I'm going to walk you through a little bit of that today. One of the things that that initial quote says, and I'm going to sort of look in both directions, in the most general sense, values represent the principles or standards of what is important in life. Now, we talk a lot about values. They can be very useful tools to support policy development and implementation. They can be used as the underlying ethic for how people make decisions in their personal and family and professional lives. So a broad enough concept that is really quite inclusive of ethical considerations. You could easily see that. There are, however, lots of different types of values. So while a value may be about a standard or some type of guidance, these categories, and this is a comprehensive but not exhaustive list of categories of human values or principles or norms, should immediately either cause you to pull your hair out with frustration. Oh my goodness, that's a problem. I only thought that there were things like right and wrong and good and bad, but you mean there are economic values that are different from social and political? Well, yes, there are. I'm going to suggest that you sort of hold in your mind the possibility that all of these value categories are operating sort of in the background. I don't want to draw too many analogies or metaphors too early in my talk, but sort of the operating system of humanity has these things kind of just churning, not always explicit. In fact, that may be, as I'll mention in a little bit, therein may lie the rub, that we're not being explicit about which value categories we're working on or working with in any one moment. I do think, however, that this background condition that I was referring to is part of what I think makes up what the 16th, 17th, and 18th century philosophers referred to as the social contract, that informal agreement that societies make with each other about how they're going to live in that society, what matters, what's important, what do we care about, how do we restrict our own rights, how do we encourage others, what should we do about living in this particular society versus another. So there is something about having a coherent set of often shared values, sometimes called a common morality, that gives societies or communities a reason to agree with each other or disagree with each other. So again, one of the sub-themes this afternoon is not just what are they, but why should it matter? Like, why does this have any bearing whatsoever on the Frost Institute's mission or the University of Miami's commitment to higher education or healthcare or any of the like? And I only have about 25 or 30 minutes to make that case to you, but I'm going to try to do it with some data and with some ethics. So here's an example which is meant to be illustrative, but not dispositive. In other words, I want to show you just a couple of slides. When we talk about economic values, here's a big list. And notice that the list is further subdivided into individual or market-related or policy or global. Again, this is a list. Full disclosure, a good chunk of this list was created by typing into ChatGPT-4. Could you list the categories of economic values? Not only did ChatGPT-4 do that for me, but it produced a reasonable facsimile of the actual summary table. So I'll let you sort of ponder on that for a moment. I'm using the value of intellectual honesty by telling you that that's what I did. I didn't just invent these. But I would suspect that if we had had a skill testing question round before I started and said, all right, everyone pull out a piece of paper as if you were an undergraduate class, and say, could you list some economic values? And I don't even know if you're economists or if you're philosophers or statisticians. I'm willing to bet that some of these terms would have come up. I have no doubt that they would have. You might not have categorized them in that way. You might have done them in different ways. We could have a spirited debate about whether they're all equivalent, whether some are more important than others, or whether they are in the right columns or the right categories. Fantastic. Let's have a discussion about that afterwards. My point is that when someone says to you, yes, there are a lot of economic values at stake that we should be thinking about, our first thought shouldn't be, yes, you're right, and it's quite challenging to compare economic values and, say, social, moral, and political values, when this is also happening sort of behind the scenes. Which type of values are we talking about? And I won't do this for every category, but here's another pretty obvious list. Those of us who work in ethics or bioethics or policy ethics often can throw around words like, well, there are a lot of ethical values or principles or norms at work. Similar type of list or a similar type of table. You may have your favorite ones up there. You may wonder why one is missing that you thought was really important. That's not the point of the table. The point of the table is to indicate more what the column headings refer to than the content within each column. That there are different types of ethical values at play. And just so that you don't get too carried away with data, the quote from Groucho Marx, whether apocryphal, original, or invented, does sort of capture one of the running problems that we who work in the value or ethics business worry about, and that is there are loads of them. The problem is not finding a value or coming up with one that hasn't been invented before. It's of those that already exist, which ones matter now for this problem at this time? And, the Groucho Marx, if you don't like these, I've got others, is sort of a charming way of saying, if you don't like these principles, there are plenty others out there. But guess what? We're still going to be faced with the same problem at the end of the day. And that is, if we do think that making decisions based on some form of connection between data or evidence or knowledge and some kind of wisdom or ethical reflection, we're still going to have to address the hard problem of which ones and when and by whom. So, in contrast, again, a simplistic or somewhat simplistic presentation, I would say that if we were to also ask, an informed undergraduate class to pull out a piece of paper and say, so what is data? Like, what is that? Everyone's talking about data this and data that. We're in a data institute. There's big data, little data. There's data all over the place. So what is that? And for the most part, the kind of epistemic framing of data is that it's something like the following criteria. It's objective or somehow value-free. It just is. It has nothing about it. A blood pressure of X over Y is a piece of data. It's only relevant and sort of actionable if the number is higher or lower in one of those two categories relative to a background set of health conditions of the patient in front of you. But data on its own, in a very, as I say, simplistic way, is meant to be at least all of these things. The second and final book that I'm not promoting is Mary Poovy's, which I have as a screenshot, which is called A History of the Modern Fact, which for those of you who do ask yourselves questions about where did this word come from or what do we take it to mean, I thought it meant this. This is a kind of historico-etymologic presentation that is quite fascinating when you realize that even the concept of a fact is a social construct. It doesn't exist in nature. We decide that this thing, she attributes sort of one of the early cases for what constitutes a fact to double entry bookkeeping. um, in the UK. You know, I have this many things, and there are those many things, and we put them on a ledger, and at the end of the day, it's not what I think, it's like, that's what they are. In fact, you can go back to, you know, the earliest Greek or even Egyptian writings on pieces of clay that list the number of sheep that someone might have as further evidence that a fact is something that exists in our mind that we use as a heuristic to explain a certain phenomenon around us. There is, of course, the epistemic kind of continuum of thinking that data is somehow a building block to something that we might call information. Organized data is information. Information, when it's curated and applied and tested in certain ways, becomes some form of knowledge. Never mind whether it's got a truth value or it's some form of enlightenment or wisdom at the end of that epistemic chain. But we do think that data, whether it's an individual datum or it's plural, is somehow a fundamental particle in a larger epistemic conversation. There are, of course, different types. I won't go over the slide. Those were sitting in the Frost Institute. But depending on what we're, so to speak, depending on what we're talking about, there are different ways of describing the same thing and similar ways of describing different things. Last of the tables, because we're in a health environment, health data is among the most interesting and yet frustrating to understand, given that it is described by many, used by many, in different ways and environments and for different reasons. So I almost feel like the word health data itself is like referring to cancer. At some point, the word sort of loses its substantive meaning other than as a generalized category of something. Health data to a policymaker is very different from health data for a clinician. I mean, sort of keeping that simple distinction in your mind would suggest that here we are again with a lot of different categories of a lot of different terms, which is very confusing. And in a way, so much for the intro to these remarks, because I now want to move to what I think is the hard part of why this should all matter and how do we become more clear than we might have been. I'm pulling again this quote out of the original Mark Carney quote that I showed you. Both value and values are judgments, and therein lies the rub. For those of you who follow decision theory or who follow some of the ongoing discussions in behavioral economics about how people make decisions under conditions of uncertainty, think here about the Kahneman and Tversky work. Think about those researchers who are understanding how people make decisions and what mental models they construct in their mind and what biases they bring to their decisions. That's what Carney is referring to when he talks about there are judgments. Picking the right set of data for the right reason at the right time for the right purpose is itself a judgment. A decision that you would make that may be automated down the road when AI can do this, but quite frankly, these kinds of judgments, and I'm not saying they are moral, they are judgments by humans about what is important and what isn't, is the rub, so to speak. So let's sort of start to combine these two big ideas that I've been working towards. This could be any number of 50 different slides that are meant to capture one way that people think and talk about value, and that is the monetization or cost or worth of all of this data. Hewlett-Packard, in its enterprise model, speaks very clearly about the benefits and advantages that organizations can derive from their data sets as being what the value of data, the sentence or the clause, the value of data means. It's an extractive position about the worth of something. Again, I'm not passing judgment. I'm not making a moral statement about that. I'm merely saying that this is one way of thinking it. And on the right-hand slide, one of many, right-hand picture, one of many that talks about, the amount of money or monetization that will accrue over the next 15 or 20 years in different enterprise sectors. Billions and billions of dollars will be made, lost, acquired, or accumulated on the basis of collected data. So big data equals big money. So as a kind of summary, the kind of economic political idea, and Carney pulled his work from the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, definition of both the noun of what value is and the verb of how one makes money, is sort of something that is often in one's mind when we think about the way in which an organization, a community, an institution, an entity thinks about value. What is something worth? What does it cost? What does it cost me to do something? What would happen if I didn't do it? It's a very economic mindset, which makes perfect sense. And we leave to others to think about the values that are at play and what might happen and how should we think about it. And, spoiler alert, I think we need to be combining these together actively, regularly, throughout the life cycle of an innovation development, throughout the life cycle of educational development, this is not an afterthought. It's an all of the above. And I'm going to give you some examples. So in the world of data, among the more charming techniques that sort of have risen to the level of a full heuristic is to pick either a metaphor or an analogy for describing what something is. So early on, data was described as the new gold, followed by, no, it's actually not gold. It's actually the new oil. But is it the new oil? We're not sure. No, it's not the new oil. It's not the new oil, it's the new soil. Not sure what that means. It's now the new oxygen, whatever. We could go online, Google data is the new, and you'll get a similar list. This isn't even ChatGPT worthy. This is just goofing around on the web. And when The Economist says that it is the world's most valuable resource, it has achieved a level beyond just the meme level. It has achieved a level of seriousness, which is why Carney cautioned in the first chapter of his book that the price of everything is becoming the value of everything. And that's worrisome, because then you've lost anything connected to social, political, ethical, religious values that might permit you to make better decisions about what you should be doing or what you shouldn't be doing. A couple of further considerations that almost conflate what seems to be a bit of a whirlpool that or vortex we're being sucked into. We're in a health sciences campus environment here, and two of the terms that enjoyed some celebratory sunshine for a number of years and then have been kind of knocked back a little bit are value-based healthcare and evidence-based medicine. Both of those terms have been, I think, given their time in the sun, have been rigorously defended, and have probably slunk back a little bit into the cave, because clearly even though the term evidence-based medicine makes for good reading, as does evidence-based policy and evidence-based fill in the blank. Very few policy or clinical decisions are based entirely on any one thing. Informed, certainly. Guided, yes. But based, no. And in the world that I've spent a good deal of my career in, the policy world, I can absolutely tell you that I know of no politician, elected or appointed, who has made a policy decision based solely on evidence or facts or data. Now, fool though they may be for disregarding something as obvious as information that proves a point, disproves a point, foolish though they may be to think that's all very nice to get some scientists and experts in the room, but I have a constituency to worry about, or I have something else to worry about. But leaving the idea, that's as far as I'll go to critique it. There's many others who've done a much better job than I have just now. These are just, as I say, further conflations of how we have tried to bring together value and values without being really clear about what we're doing or why we're doing it or what we should be doing and when. So I want to give you now some actual case examples, things that I've been working on with some colleagues over the years, and others have been, that are trying to make the case for how this conflation could or arguably should work. And I'm going to give you 4 of them. There's probably a slide or 2 each, and then we can open it up for questions. So the first one, I should say, this is the other qualifying humorous interlude. Please pay attention as the ethics have changed. Why do I say that? Because in some ways, those of us who've worked in the world of applied ethics in healthcare are often accused of sort of coming into every room with our little bag of ethical principles or guidelines or textbooks and say, right, here's the answer. Or worse, I don't have the answer, but I've got a few more problems that you haven't thought of. And I want to show you that I'm an expert by giving you my full attention and house inspection credentials to show you how smart I am. And if you've been in either the clinical or policy or research world long enough, you know that gets you into a room once. That's sort of entertainment, but it doesn't get you invited back. The only way you're going to be invited back and be helpful is to help someone solve a problem that they have. And it may not be your problem, it's their problem. This is where some of my newest best friends over the last few years have been the engineers, who actually see the world through problem solving. Not don't care about ethics, on the contrary, do care about ethics. But to come to something and say, I see this as a problem, doesn't have to be a dilemma. Not everything has to be sort of so richly described as having a wicked problem so wicked it can't be solved. There are things that need solving, and let's try and solve them. So I'll give you a couple of examples. This is an old one, as I say, an oldie but a goodie, and it relates to the issue of how we can make better use of already collected administrative health data. And the story in a nutshell, and I'm happy to share the references with you afterwards, is in the state of Western Australia, there has long been one of the world's largest electronic administrative health databases called the Western Australia Data Set. And back in the early part of the century, in the early 2000s, it became obvious that Australia was falling behind the rest of the world with respect to drug safety and how they were monitoring drug safety, adverse effects of medicines in the community. The standard model had been post-marketing surveillance studies, phase 4 studies, and adverse reporting reports that would come through physicians' offices and the like, known to be useful, but certainly not a comprehensive way of understanding everything that's happening in the environment. And a couple of very thoughtful researchers involved in the large data linkage project at the University of Western Australia proposed something, you hopefully have read it over my shoulder now, proposed something which they considered to be rather dramatic, and that's to tap into the existing administrative health data. This, of course, is a statewide health system, so it's not a private system, but everyone who comes into hospital or gives birth, administrative health data gets loaded in, and it's been there, sort of minding its own self for a while. And the research community came along and said, what if we were to undertake a study of that administrative health data to learn more about drug safety, which raised sort of ironically a number of ethical questions, like those people did not consent for their administrative health data to be used in research. It's not the same as a clinical trial, but it was collected for part of their care. And now it's going to be used for another purpose. Should we get the consent of everyone in Western Australia to see if we can use their already collected data for another purpose? Should we, and these were real questions, should we anonymize all of the data in the Western Australia data set to ensure that we protect privacy and the like, which would have its own drawbacks, because then what do you do, etc. So they had a long conversation, and eventually the proposal went through. And the screenshot from the Australian Medical Journal of a paper that my colleague Fiona Stanley and I wrote, with the quote below it, is what was then considered a very almost dangerously unethical assertion we were making. Dr. Stanley, if you don't know, is one of the world's foremost pediatric preventive health physicians. I mean, there's a stamp of her as Australian of the Year. There's a hospital named after her in Perth. She was one of the original authors of the studies on folic acid for neural tube defects. I mean, this is a person who cares about the health of the population. And I was there as a visiting prof, and we did some work together. And before too long, we realized that we had a challenging topic that we both agreed on. And I was probably a little out of the mainstream, because by now you've read the quote, which basically said, we think it's unethical not to use that data. Now, that's an odd thing, or it was an odd thing 20 odd years ago, because with the predominant ethic of consent, which I still believe in very strongly, we found ourselves in a position of what do we do about the value of that data and the values associated with making use of it. And this was the proposal, and it's been a proposal that has been now well adopted in many Canadian provinces, in a number of US states and elsewhere. It's how to make use of existing health data resources. A second example from a number of years later, Ken mentioned that I was at Indiana University for 15 years, which was a delightful period in my career, because I got to partner with and collaborate with some of the most interesting bioinformatics and electronic health record people really in the country. But in addition to that kind of collaboration, Indianapolis is a city that is positioned within an almost unique environment with the private sector. It's the home headquarters of Eli Lilly. There are many orthopedic and cardiovascular device companies in that state, a state that has 5.5 million people. It sort of punches above its weight in this area. In a state with, at that time, one medical school, the largest medical school in the US, as it turns out, and an opportunity for the private sector and the publicly funded university to think carefully about partnering. So the example, which is really just a simple one, but at the time set off a few alarm bells, was the heretical idea of partnering between the private sector and a public university. And not just the private sector endowing a chair or renovating a laboratory or putting its name on a building, the so-called edifice complex, but rather to think seriously and carefully about how they could partner in a way that maximized the interests of both. Strange idea then, less strange now perhaps, but still not widely accepted for reasons that tend to be limited to worries about some conflict of interest or some deeper morally held belief about what the nature of the private sector is versus what the nature of higher education is. This isn't the room to have that discussion, but let's just say I think it's a new environment and the things we used to think probably aren't as true as they were anymore. That's probably as far as I'll go at this point. But the paper made the case for not only why these partnerships could occur, but what the mechanism would be. So it's not just a philosophic, one ought to think about doing this, and it might be a good idea. But an actual arrangement was structured around what we called principles and benchmarks for ethically credible collaboration. And in the next, this is a JAMA paper. This may be large enough to read, but this is a screenshot of those principles and the benchmarks by which those principles would be assessed. These were negotiated by groups from both industry, in this case it was Merck and Indiana University's School of Medicine. You will see some familiar principles or values on the left-hand side, that column. They're not brand new. They were on the list that I showed you about 6 slides ago. Some of them are new or maybe interpreted differently, but the most important thing is not so much the names of the principles, but that there were benchmarks for assessment that would be undertaken jointly by a committee consisting of people from both groups with research proposals that had to be vetted internally for maximizing joint interest with these two entities. It worked extremely well. And when I say for many years, I don't mean it stopped working well, but I left Indiana University in 2016. It may still be working as far as I know. But at that time, it was only the second such benchmarking, principle-based collaborative agreement that existed, as far as we could tell in the literature, in the United States. And I think that was probably true because of an initial well-intentioned hesitancy to create these kinds of partnerships because of a fear that it might offend or worry some constituency associated with either group. Someone thinking that one was taking advantage of the other or being taken advantage of in some other way. The third of the 4 examples is really quite recent, and it combines 2 extremely large data categories, genomic data and health data. And it's one of the many projects that the WHO has been undertaking recently on the issue of data sharing amongst different communities and regions. Believe it or not, although it's an 18 or 19-page document, I couldn't list all of the principles on this slide. So my point is not to show you every principle. You can read it. It's the WHO document, WHO genomics data sharing, and you'll pick it up as quickly as you need to. I mention this not so much to prove a point. I wasn't involved in this particular project, but that they have done something interesting. If you remember in that first list, I showed you just the names of a principle or the names of a value. And you thought, oh, that's very interesting. Efficiency, solidarity, fascinating. Don't know what it means, but that sounds like a nice principle to me. What WHO has done and others are doing is explaining, or what we might call stipulating, what they mean when they say this is the value that we are trying to promote. So you will see as you read through this, I put a commitment to, because that begins each one of those several principles. I find it fascinating, important, and a great development in the world of how value and values work together. There is, of course, a side story that goes with this, and I think I'm just about done, Justin. And that is, behind this sort of debate is an almost historically charming one about whether scientists really do like sharing their data. I mean, it's a nice thing to say how we should do it and what we should be thinking about when we're doing it. But it turns out this is an area of deep empirical study. Not everybody likes to share. Some people don't share because they think they're not allowed to. HIPAA prevents me from doing it, or whatever the equivalent privacy rules are in a jurisdiction, or my university won't. There's like lots of, I would like to, but I can't. There's interoperability issues. I wish I could, but his thing won't talk to my thing, so I wish I could, but I can't. There are lots of studies of this kind. So this is not the answer to a problem, but this is providing more tools for the toolkit. Lastly, a project I was involved in with the OECD, and I'll close with this one. This goes by the slightly mouthful concept of a framework for anticipatory governance of emerging technologies. Familiar phraseology for those of us who work in governance and policy, that the old model tended to silo decision-making at the right moment for the right person, almost a just-in-time model of policy development. But we now know that since technology moves so quickly, often faster than the regulatory environment can even catch up. You know, by the time it goes through a public comment period and developing a regulation and then submitting it for comment, you know, you've already moved on to 2.0 or 3.0 of the thing that you were working on. So fortunately, lots of people have been thinking about this problem and applying a life cycle approach to policy development and evaluation, much like the life cycle that we apply in science and technology generally. You know, there's early phase stuff, there's middle phase stuff, there's end phase stuff, there's phase 4, 5, 6. So why not apply that same thinking to governance? And what OECD has done, and they just adopted this last April and are sort of workshopping it around the world in the regions, is to think about governance using this values model that I've been alluding to in two important ways, or in one important way with two parts. One is what they call a set of foundational values that apply irrespective of the technology. Synthetic biology, quantum, genomics, doesn't matter. Because in science and in tech and in innovation, there are a set of foundational or fundamental values that most people working today, irrespective of culture, climate, political orientation, sort of feel a common brother or sisterhood with. And then there's a set of technology-specific values that might actually make a difference. So we can't just speak about genomics and wind turbine development in the same mouthful. There are other sets of considerations that apply. And what I find most useful about this is not so much that it is a better description of how value and values work together. It's acknowledging where they exist in thinking, which I think is quite a novel approach. I mean, think of the model of clinical trials or medical research, where the ethics part probably only comes in at the IRB level, or maybe at the scientific integrity, research misconduct level, but never at the beginning, never at the early, like, are we going to invest, is this university going to invest in this area of science? Ethics question? No, economic question. I beg to differ. And I think Carney's right, that they all involve judgments of one form. And whenever you're in the world of making judgments with heuristics and biases that are informing or clouding your decision, and where at the end of the day, you believe that there's some worth or value that's going to come from the decision, someone will be harmed, someone might be benefited. Guess what? Like it or not, you're in the area of some form of ethical and social value. This is more of a reminder that we're not out of the woods yet. There are lots of things that are conspiring against this slightly over-rational view I've been presenting, which has largely been we should think about values in many ways. We should involve them early in decision-making. And I'm sure the heads in the room here and maybe some heads online are nodding, yes, I agree with all of that. And yet we are faced with at least these 5 impediments or disruptors, each of which would benefit from a talk or 2 or 3, misinformation and disinformation being probably the scariest of all. But let me close with another reminder from, the book is on my shelf at home, so I'm not going to show it to you here. But Brian Christian's book, The Alignment Problem, which I recommend if you haven't already, is focused largely on large language models and machine learning and AI. And the summary, which has a lot of verbiage on the slide, is meant to capture what I think is not just for AI, but is actually for all discussions about data. And I am going to read this part to you because I think it makes a pretty strong point as you're looking at the picture of the sorcerer's apprentice on the right-hand side. As machine learning systems grow not just pervasive but increasingly powerful, we'll find ourselves in the position of the sorcerer's apprentice. We conjure a force, autonomous but totally compliant, give it a set of instructions and scramble like mad to stop it once we realize our instructions are imprecise or incomplete. How to prevent such a catastrophic divergence? How to ensure that these models capture our norms and values, understand what we mean or intend, and above all, do what we want as a name? The alignment problem. So I encourage you to read Brian's book. So, should they matter? I'm happy to take questions and comments for the remaining time. Thanks very much. Will we be able to take any from
I was just going to ask.
I was just going to look here and see that one.
If you are online and you have a question or comment, we're going to see if we can find a way to let you express it.
So the questions in the room to start.
I'll jump in with a question or a couple questions. One is an observation that about values. I was surprised that you didn't have a professional there in that list. You know, I understand just the tentative list, but the broad kind of idea that there's a role for alignment and that's sort of foundational to how we sort of think through what is data. There's a sense in which, and I take it this is where you're going as well, that characterizing data as a social construction important because once you realize that in itself, there's judgments there, there's value judgments there, all of these things that it's not. I'm just trying to get where it all aligns, and I take it that you were kind of thinking holistically, but I'm trying to come up with exactly how to put the question. That somehow the challenges for that alignment is in the sense the values and the judgments run all the way through it. it's sometimes people try to sidestep the values by saying, oh, a fact is a fact. And sometimes, people sometimes use that little quaint thing, but you can't. You can have your own values, but you can't have your own fact. But in a sense, you're questioning that, but it's a funny feature that, in a sense, that there really is a way in we can't avoid the judgment. And is that sort of where what your thinking is?
Thanks, Lessa. The short answer is yes, but,
Okay.
and the yes part is it shouldn't be a dramatic statement to say that decision making in the world of data is inevitably tied to decisions that people make about what they're going to study, how they're going to use it, why they're using it, what methods, and all of those things involve some form of judgment. Maybe it's implicit, maybe it's professional, maybe it's sort of automatic. We're studying this. This is how you study this. I don't have to think about it. That's the beauty of having protocols and methods and approaches and standards that allows us to, in a sense, automate some kinds of judgment. So the idea is not so much at every step in the life cycle of a new product being developed, everyone's got to roll up their sleeves and say, right, which values are we going to use today? It's a much more almost, I don't mean it as a criticism of myself, but it's a much more innocuous and obvious statement. And that is every decision that we make involving human data inevitably is connected in some way to the values that people are assigning to it regardless. So that's the yes. Here's the but part. The but part is if we have to do this for every decision, we're going to exhaust ourselves. We won't add a lot of, no pun intended, a lot of value to the decision. That's why in the world of IRBs, for example, there's a good, healthy discussion going on about having a centralized IRB. You don't have to have 25 IRBs for a 25-site study. The 23rd and 24th is probably not going to come up with a new revision to a consent form that the first 11 hadn't already found. So there's lots to be said about the habit of good judgment that we'd like to cultivate. The other part of the but part is I do think that when it comes to something like a new technology or something that we haven't been fully sort of familiar with over the years, it's not a bad idea to pause. I don't mean stop studying. I mean to pause and sort of refresh our thinking about what we think about this. And I'll give you an example. In genomics, until we had finished mapping and sequencing the genome, and by the way, since this is possibly recorded, I didn't direct the Human Genome Project. I directed the ELSI program of the Human Genome Project.
Who would make that mistake?
I don't know, the ethical, legal, social implications. So
Who's
ethically.
But since you paused, and we have merely 5 minutes to go, but surely some values are going to be better than others. Right? Suppose I'm in a business, and so my values are I don't know, corruption, greed, and exploitation. Those are my values. You would be able to make an argument that perhaps I've chosen the wrong values. We're not too relativistic here, right?
Absolutely, and that's part of when I was referring to the but part. Right. That when you're it's that kind of liminal space that I think this presentation is best designed for. The emerging technology space, not the clinical trials version, but when we're in a new environment, where do we go? And the argument should not simply be what's the economic value to us one way or the other. The example that you're right that I was alluding to before I interrupted myself we started thinking differently about genomics and biobanking and collecting data and what mattered and whether privacy was as important as consent or confidentiality. After it became possible to collect infinitesimally small pieces of human beings, find out a lot about them without ever meeting them, that paradigm was a paradigm shifting moment in the ethics of research. It's now quite common to think about biobanks and what a consent form might look like and what you're consenting to. And we have quibbling debates about what those things should look like. But as recently as 15 years ago, we didn't. So I think the more we use case examples like the few I showed, the more I think something like this could be yes and rather than yes but. Justin.
Eric, thanks very much for the talk. So one of the questions that came up, it was near the last few slides that you shared, where you shared the example of what you had done with Merck in terms of establishing a benchmark or got a set of principles for the collaborations, and then the World Health Organization has something similar. How do you turn that into an agreement? Like how do you bring those philosophies into something that is executable in terms of a contract or a partnership agreement?
Right.
And things of that nature?
So the good news and the short answer is the Merck IU thing was an actual signed agreement. It went all the way up to the level that needed signature because it was committing funds, institutional space, students on both sides. So it was more than just a sort of a generic agreement. It was an actual signed agreement. It had a beginning date, an end date, a review committee. It had a process for agreeing on which projects would be jointly funded by this. There was money going into it. So that's a standalone example. The other example of the WHO is, depending if you are an optimist about these things or a pessimist, is, it is another framework, just like the OECD document. It's another framework with more specificity than prior ones that is meant to be taken up and adopted by those who wish to take it up and adopt it. And as I say, I tend to be a bit of a multilateralist. I do think that there are good reasons to have organizations that set a global standard or set a global commitment and hope that people will take it on board and apply it locally. But they're two very different models.
I just have fascinating. Thank you very much for the talk. I just again a little bit following up to Justin's question. And speaking about the values of value, why Merck did that? By the way, Merck was my previous company, so I know very well, and I'm very familiar with this kind of big collaborations. But why would a pharmaceutical company like Merck would have an agreement like that with IU? Before that, we had an agreement actually with the Moffitt Cancer Center.
Yes.
Huge, right? So
why?
So yes. So and is that how that can be translated to the values, right? Because clearly, a company like Merck or any other country, my previous institution actually we had Novartis that it worked with TSRI
Yes.
or Pfizer, right? And there they were saying basically every intellectual property that is coming from TSRI, Novartis or J&J before and Pfizer at the end will have the rights of first refusal. Right, so there is all sort of different kind of things, and how do you balance these kind of things?
Sure, I'll give you a fast answer, and we can chat more afterwards. And it actually relates to Les's observation about professionalism, which was not excluded; it just wasn't included in the list. I think the number one predictor of why that project worked, that collaboration, were the people. The leadership in both places made a personal commitment to having it work. So it wasn't just, how does this work? Because actually Novartis had one at the University of Maryland that we studied, big deal. Okay, and there's lots of places that partner and collaborate. This one was unique because they wanted to go further than just, let's have an MOU, let's agree to do some things together, and they put money in. And I think it was a rare moment in time when leadership saw an opportunity, saw a friend or a collaborator who had similar interests. The paper has a longer list of what the shared interests were, not just what the benchmarks were, which is an evaluation tool, but why are we coming to this? And that description, it wasn't like the Magna Carta or the Declaration of Independence, but it did list the values and beliefs that both had in advancing science, in advancing health, in particular areas, not just generically. So it was time limited, financially bounded, and I think politically protected by certain leaders.
And on that note, you get the last question.
So, and in that regards, how would someone foster that type of behavior in not having that special circumstance to have these individuals or different parties act in a more ethical way to do these types of collaborations? One example is, right, Facebook's not going to give up their data to a university and vice versa, and how do you get people to see the mutual benefit?
Yeah.
Because you have competing interests, right? You have people who need to get promoted from the academic point of view, and you have shareholders, meaning of the company, Facebook, to do what they to make money for the people who own the
So
company.
to take that example to the present, it's a little probably unfair to the example and unfair to the present because lots of things have changed, in the world since then. But I would say that this is not my magic list of if you do these three things, it will happen. But I do think that there have been some changing factors that lead to a greater likelihood that this would occur in certain places. One is, let's be honest, the nature of promotion and tenure in higher education. It's changing. The idea of whether people go into universities for a lifetime or come for a period of time and then leave and go elsewhere, it's changing. The nature of the labor market for science, technology, and innovation, people are moving a lot more quickly or a lot more horizontally. Second is this example that I gave you was not a one-off. It had been preceded by several years of collaboration, back and forths, people spending time in one lab, spending time in another lab, learning what the other lab was like. Oh, they're doing diabetes research over there. So are we. We happen to have patients in our hospitals. They don't, but they got that really cool equipment over there. I wonder if there's something we can do. So it was, I don't mean forced voluntarism or forced humanitarianism or philanthropy, but the idea of learning about what they're doing. It's not all or nothing, because the example you gave, I'm not going to give up my data. I'm sure that's true. In fact, we know that's true. We know lots of places who have no interest in doing it. And, at another time over coffee, we can talk about what it means for someone to have a shared interest. What is it to have a mutual interest? So interest theory, and it's not just am I interested in this, but do I have a stake in the outcome of this collaboration? And if I have a stake, it could be financial, it could be political, it could be regulatory, and you have a stake, then we come to an agreement. It's very much like the new world of philanthropy, which is no longer the grateful patient model. I hope someone gives money to my medical school because we saved someone's life. It's how can philanthropy be used sort of strategically, sometimes called philanthrocapitalism, but Warren Buffett didn't just give his money to the Gates Foundation to get a tax return. He did it because he thought that was the best use, that was the best return on investment of his money that he could find. And that's a very different model. I don't have time to do how does that work here, but I do think there are similar features to how advancement, philanthropy, capacity building, and collaboration are look differently now than they did even 5, 10, or 20 years ago. And that's not a Canada-US difference. I think it's happening in many places. So lots more to be said.
And in fact, sometimes businesses discover that they can maximize profit by collaborating. Why would I make my source code available unless I thought I could build even bigger market share, where someone else might say, but that's your precious code, right? On that note, to our colleagues at IDISC, at Institute for Data Science and Computing at the University of Miami, to our colleagues in Ontario, join me in thanking Dr. Meslin for a wonderful presentation.